So just sitting forward for a few moments. As far forwards as you can do so without feeling that you're about to slip off the chair, but also slightly angled forward, so your pelvis tilts forwards. So that brings your weight more into your feet and your head further forwards. So you're not sort of like fixing right at the back over your hips. Take a couple of slow, gentle breaths and just see if you can get a sense of sinking into the chair. Maybe that little bit of pressure in your feet, encouraging your feet to have this feeling of sort of almost melting into the floor. But also having a sense, particularly in the upper part of your body, of your upper part of your body sort of sinking into the middle of the body. So I've talked before about this idea of inner structure, inner strength in the past, so that you feel supported, and so the back, shoulders, arms, the front of your body don't feel quite so stressed. So there's a need for them to stiffen up to hold you upright, although you will slip back into doing that. Rubbing your hands together, tapping over your face. And over your head and neck. Come on for one shoulder, your arm, the other side, upper part of your chest. Your belly. And finally your legs. Now, feet out, so you drop back into the chair. And this is a useful posture. Once you get comfortable in this position, or you could imagine sitting back in your favorite armchair or something like that, always assuming it doesn't just encourage you to go to sleep, which you can do, of course, quite easily. But that aside, that's when I talked about that sense of sort of dropping into the chair, of sort of the outer region of your body, sort of sinking into the middle of the body. This gives you a sort of an idea of what that might feel like, because they're quite difficult ideas, I think, to kind of visualize. Whereas this is, I think, is pretty much an everyday posture. You sort of flop back, and so we want to do that in the upright postures. But of course, one of the things that blocks us doing that in the upright postures is this sort of background fear almost of, well, it's going to collapse because gravity is pulling us down. But if you think about what's happening in the chair, gravity's actually pulling you into the chair, so it's helping with that feeling. If I was sort of, I know it's an absurd idea, but if I was sitting like this, and I was saying to you, but I don't feel very relaxed, and I'm all tight in my back. Well, of course I'm all tight in my back. So if I don't have that tension in my back, I'm just going to fall over. So it also sort of shows us very clearly that this issue of alignment and how we line our body up and how we relate to the pull of gravity when we're in an upright position, how important those things are to this releasing feeling that we're looking for. But just notice whatever there is to notice. Really, It's a very personal thing. You know, how do your shoulders feel? How does your chest feel? What's your breathing doing? How does your back feel? And so on and so forth. Because these are things that we can remember when we come to the upright position. So do that now. Come to the upright position and find a place in the chair that's comfortable for you, that you feel you can maintain without straining for a while. Of course, you're free to move at any time, and you'll see me move around on occasion. So at the start, I said, you know, to tilt forwards. If you think about it, if I do this from the side, if my weight's back in my hips and I'm in a kind of strict upright position, actually there was quite a strong pull backwards. Whereas if I can just tilt the pelvis a little bit, that brings my head and it brings my weight more into this area here, about a third of the way, but don't get too caught up on that. And you can just go forwards and back because you can just find that position where at least some of those characteristics we recognize in the reclining position start to make themselves felt in the more upright position. And once again, this sense of releasing as much as possible. And just to remind you of the image that I've used for that release, and the Chinese term is sung. There's many different elements to it, but if you hold one hand out, roll your fingers into a fist and squeeze tightly, you'll find that it's a really uncomfortable position. Your wrist, your arm, your shoulder and elbow and everything just sort of tightens up, and it takes quite a lot of effort actually to hold that. And then you just soften the fingers until there's a little hollow, there's a little hole through the middle. You could almost look through the middle. So you've still got a structure there. You've still got the fist there. It's not like you just drop the arm down. So the change from the really tight feeling to that softer feeling is the one that I would associate with this term releasing. Letting go is another term that is sometimes used to describe that feeling. Relax, we sometimes talk about, but it's not strictly accurate. But again, you know, it's really, we don't want to get into the semantics of it. We just want to try and have some kind of label that reminds us of the experience of it. But beginning to turn your head, and as much as we can, we maintain that feeling through all of the movements. That, of course, is quite tricky and brings up the issue of how we're moving as well. And if you can get a sense of that stronger feeling within the body, let's see if you can just relate to the idea that the movement is initiated from that. So as you turn your head, there's a slight sensation, particularly as your spine goes into your neck, with a very gentle rotation in the spine, minuscule, but by the time it kind of radiates out to the rest of the body, it will increase in range. And then hands on your shoulders, circling forwards. Direction. As well as being useful in their own right, of course, these little joint releases do actually give us a chance to practice a way of moving, a way of bringing mind and body both in into the movement that we want to maintain as much as possible. Hands out to your sides. Rotation is in your shoulder joint. Another thing that we begin to notice, and again, this is something we want to try and remain aware of through all of the movements, is that when I turn my hand palm forwards, there's an opening across the chest. When I turn them the other way, that closes, the openings across my upper back. That is a two-way connection. So if I exaggerate, if I push my chest out, I can use that movement there to generate the rotation of the arms and vice versa. That is very exaggerated. These are very subtle movements. And then winding your arms around. And one of the outcomes of getting the posture correct and being able to get that sense of releasing, softening, is that we're able to just encourage more of the body to become involved in any particular movement. Back the other way. And that leads to that very flowing quality that is so characteristic of Tai Chi. Rest your hands. Now just tilt forwards on the bones at the base of your pelvis. Let your weight go into your feet. And before it becomes too uncomfortable, pushing back, feeling your hips drop back into the chair. One more time going forwards, and then as you come back this time, you turn a little bit, and the forwards, majority of your weight going into one leg. So when I go forwards, I don't want my head to go beyond my knee, and I don't want to be right out here. So to a large extent, the range of movement that we make is going to be defined by the positioning of our feet and our hips. But we can go beyond that a little bit, and particularly when we bring our arms into the movement. But this is the feel of the movement that we're looking for whenever we do that. Try on the other side. And then going around. And change direction. And come back to the central position. And then just take a few steps out. When your legs fully extended, the knees should still feel quite soft. So it's not a long step. And then on the other side. The hands drop down to your sides. So as we begin to move into the more complex exercises, really what we want is for all the things that I've been talking about thus far to kind of slip into the background, not to disappear, but to slip into the background. Because a lot of our attention is going to be on, particular intricacy, particular pattern that we're doing. But these things will tick away in the back of our minds, and that process is quite a useful one because it encourages this development of a sort of intuitive, kind of subconscious intuition about it, which is something that we'll carry with us out of the class, I think. So hands by your sides, turn the palms of your hands forward. Your weight is more back in your hips. Distribution of your weight at this point, about 60% of your weight in your hips, 40% in your legs. When you go forward, your arms just hanging from your shoulders. Here, it feels more like sort of 50 or maybe as much as 60% in my feet, the rest in my hips. So not a huge weight shift. And just take those few moments to rest, particularly when you're over the legs. Feel the compression of the legs turn into a releasing spring-like quality. And to an extent, you may notice that in lower back and hips, buttocks. You sort of sink into those areas a little bit and then get pushed back out. Do one more round. And next time, changing into fisherman castanet, but doing one thing less. You're not going to rotate the arms. Just allow them to be pulled along behind your shoulders. So your arms maintain this quiet position, and they're still in the back of your mind, this sense of the weight of your upper body draining into this central area, in and around your spine. Be aware of the interplay of the muscles of your back and your sides. Again, side view. I can't do the other arm, but you see, what I'm not doing is always a temptation to move the arms first, but your weight moves, that causes your shoulders to go forward, and your hands will follow. It's the fisherman castanet. Then rolling the ball in towards your chest, pulling back. This is a pull on your arms. You imagine the ball in front of your arms draped over it, push down with your feet, your shoulders get pushed back, and notice how my arm follows. And rest on the ball, drawing the ball in, my elbow drops. So another thing that gradually we become aware of in the back of our minds is just the quality of the movement that we're looking for. So that when we're losing that, as is easily done, then we have an idea of where we want to go back to. And it really works through that process of releasing, noting where the tightness is, releasing tension there. That's particularly true, I think, with experience, familiar with the exercises. So that process of coming back again becomes not quite automatic. We're more aware of it. There's something that's automatic. There's something regular and familiar. This time changing to pigeon spreads its wings. So now, once again, we feel upper chest, upper part of the chest, upper part of your back, very much engaged in the movement. One of the ways that we maintain this softer and yet strangely stronger quality within our body is just to try and keep the pattern of weight movement between your hips. Let that dictate the pace of the movement. You could imagine that you're moving in water, so your arms are always have to held back a little bit. And to recognize how in conditions like that, it's quite natural for our body to connect up. If you're just waving to somebody, you know, as they're leaving your house, you can do this quite easily. Imagine doing that in water. You'd have to put a bit more effort in. You'd have to use more of your arm. So we begin to build, alongside everything else, a feeling of connection, to move our arms, other parts of our body engage in one way or another. Push and wave. I was in a martial arts class once where the teachers had us doing some sort of conditioning work, and you know, we had two of us standing either end of one of these wooden benches you get in school gyms, holding it above our head and just lifting it up and lowering it. And he looked at me and he said, "Don't bend your knees. Don't use your legs." And I had to stop and think, how do I do this without other parts of my body coming into play? It was quite strange, because I wouldn't normally do that. And even when I did try and do it, it was clear that it was just an impression. I wasn't bending my knees anymore, but other parts of my body were still engaged. And if we can recognize that, then we begin to cultivate it. And then your hands twisted. So we start to get this sense of movement, not in isolated parts of the body, or even sort of like an entire arm with the muscles and everything, but through more and more of the body. Areas of the body that don't appear to be directly connected. And it's this sense of the movement itself flowing through your body, from front to back, side to side, from one arm to another, from one hip to a leg, or whatever. It starts to give us this sense of the energy of the movement. Turning your hands out. So, as always, each movement has its own particular sort of connections. There's always common ground between all of the movements. Your spine is always going to be involved. But as we move out from the sort of like center of the movement, we find more and more variety, more and more patterning. As we do that, we might just find ourselves sort of kind of understanding these things a bit more. And one useful question, I think, is it helpful? Is that way of doing it helpful? Is it helping the movement? Or am I just responding to a pattern that I maybe picked up years ago? And then turning your hands palm down, polishing the table. Don't overextend your arms. What happens is here, my hips are dropping back. It's like somebody's taken hold of my top of my trousers and is pulling me back. I turn, and my back lengthens and my arm lengthens like a cat. When a cat's on the prowl, it kind of ease forwards, their whole body gets behind and moving. One more time. Good, and turning your hand palm up. Push down through feet and hips to get that lengthening, rising feeling through your torso. Draining away again. One more time. Try and be as clear on the shapes of the movements as possible. Wild goose. Now parting the clouds, easing forwards just a little. Sit back into your hips and then pushing up. Again, I'm going to exaggerate something that we would look to feel, but it shouldn't really be like this. If you watch it, as I come back, it's almost like my hips are coming back. See how my back seems to bend there. As I sink into my hips, there's a push up from the hips, and that bend releases. Sometimes described as being like a bow from a bow and arrows from here to here. But you see, I mean, this really is terribly exaggerated. If you keep doing it like that, your back will start to ache very, very quickly. So this is really about the feel of the movement through your body. It's very subtle. So we don't get that feeling by playing around with the back. And, you know, so, oh, I've got to do this with my back or whatever. We get that feeling by paying attention to our feet, transfer of weight, working with the sense of connection in the body. That's something we increasingly come to recognize. Now let your hands drop down. Dragon plucks the stars from the sky. There's a variety of exercises, gives us a chance to really explore those patterns of movement within the body. One more time. And put hands together. Lengthening through your back. and then contract it. But rush the point of change. One more time. And then one foot forwards, knees still a little bit bent, most of your weight staying back. So extensions through your back and spine, again, hips sinking back, drawing your arms and hands over. And time, twisting your hands, sink back into your hips, then with the forward movement, swinging your arms over, grasping the tiger's ears. Four. And then change. And grasping the tiger's ears. Good. And come back to sitting for a moment. So the more complex the exercise that we find ourselves doing, the more in Tai Chi we want to come back to these very, very subtle movements in weight, in the turning of the center. And actually, it's a bit like a kind of inverted pyramid. Down at the bottom, there's only so many options for your weight. So it could be in the middle, but all the time it's moving, it's going to move between hips and feet and hips in one combination or another. And having moved into, say, this right leg of mine, then for the next movement, there's almost certainly going to be some kind of movement to somewhere else. And you haven't got that many options. Turn in the center, very similar. It's got a limited range of movement through which you can turn without it becoming a strain. So we have fairly limited options when we're thinking about hips and legs and weight change and so on and so forth. But of course, in the upper part of the body, lots of options. And one of the images I like to use sometimes is of a kind of well-tended garden. You walk in to the garden, there's flowers everywhere, and sort of obviously looked after. If you were to dig down, you would find the majority of the flowers have a very, very similar root structure. You'd also find that there's a fairly limited number of root structures available. A big bush or tree would have slightly different to say, I don't know, a bulb or something like that. But even underlying that, there are some fairly straightforward grounding principles. And yet above the surface, there's this sort of blossoming out into lots of changes, and sometimes a confusing mass, but color, shape of the leaves, size, so on and so forth, all of those things. And Tai Chi works in much the same way. And our priority is to really try and work with those deeper qualities to bring them more towards the surface. So part the wild horse's mane, starting with your weight in your right hip, you go forwards and turn into the left foot, and then back. And then go in the other direction. So now, hands in front of you, going forwards, turn into your left and back. And then when you get back in your right hip, move across into your left, turn in slightly, and then forwards towards the right leg and back. And just noting how your arms are moving with you. Smallest detail can make a difference. Here, we go across into our left hip, or you go to your left hip. It's only about 60% of the weight there, so it requires a lot of attention to pick that up. Then we move towards the right, and again, rest there for a moment. Now going forwards, turning, and just let that movement push your arm out. It's only quite a minimal movement with the arms. Turn the left hand arm down. Hold the ball. Part in the wild horse's mane. Soft through your body, connected. Weight sinking down. Do one more to each side. Good. And then your hands come to rest. A couple of slow, gentle breaths. Okay, now just rubbing your hands together. Tapping over your face. Over your head and neck. Onto one shoulder, your arm. On the other side. Upper part of your chest. Your belly. And finally, your legs. Pushing your heels up and down. And it's interesting, I mean, this is not a particularly Tai Chi movement. And yet, when we bring a sense of awareness that's been developed in Tai Chi to the movement, we realize again, this is not an isolated movement. There's a little bit of a press down through the balls of your feet, the contraction elsewhere, and so on and so forth. And then going around in a circle. And go back the other way. Okay, and then standing. So as we move from seated to standing, be aware that we have, well, you could say we have the information that we need in terms of what are we looking for in this particular stance. And they're those same qualities that we found really in the reclining position, or at least some of them. You might not get all of them. And then we want to think about, well, how do we find those? We want to be in line with the pull of gravity. So this brings us back to some of the really basic things. Stand with your feet hip width apart, toes pointing forwards, and rocking your weight forwards and backwards. And I know I go on about this exercise a lot, but there really isn't a substitute for it. It'll be when I go too far forwards, that's going to happen. As soon as I go out of line, there's the potential for tightness to set in, but it doesn't become a reality for a few moments. Here, I can feel my calf muscles are working, but they haven't taken on that grip in. Now they have, and that's starting to happen. So it's a really interesting exercise, and it takes a little bit further. So here, just to be clear, if you see, imagine the poles inside, this is what's happening. See how that line of the pole is moving with me. I'm not bending here, moving away from it or anything like that, or even this. And bring your arms into the movement. Hands out to your sides, fingers quite soft, and they trail behind. And just see if you can have a sense for your whole skeleton moving as one unit. And the skeleton's connected, tendons, ligaments, those connective tissues join up the muscles. There are very few bones that are totally isolated in your body. And certainly the central skeleton, the main supportive network, will naturally move as one unit. It's a bit like it's doing this. Imagine sort of from there to there to there to there and so on. And that includes your arm, but your arms are following the movement. Imagine doing this in water. You can take this a stage further. Imagine you're in a river, you're facing the flow of the river. So going forward, you're moving against the flow of the river, but then going back, You're just allowing the river to push you a little bit, but not to push you right over. And then going forwards again. So it's a slightly complex image, but it's an interesting one to work with. After a while, you reverse that. So you imagine the river's pushing you forwards and you need to stop it pushing you over and then find a way back. So when we think of that, we start to experience a contrast between front and back. And we start to feel that it's a bit more connected in the direction that we're moving in, because your intent is to move forwards, and you couldn't move against the flow of the water without there being some kind of connection and some kind of strength there. So again, this is an exercise that through that imagery can help us begin to relate to a sensation within the body. So as we go forward, so imagine we're facing the flow. We go forward, the front of the body is yang, the rear of the body is yin. As we go back, that changes the back. So your back and buttocks and so on are yang, front is yin. And then once again, there's a change within the body. Yang, yang in this direction, and so on and so forth. And those changes, yin yang, are the changes that we find all the way through the system. So now, next time you go back in your heels and you begin to come forwards, wait until you feel the weight just behind the balls of your feet. And instead of going forwards that little bit extra, you wouldn't get a lot further anyway. Let your hips drop back and going into this sinking and pushing up. Various ways that we experience that yin-yang rhythm and change. Bringing your hands around as though you're cradling the ball and pushing up and sinking down. Do this one more time. Now, have one foot forwards and with the same idea. So obviously, as we change the exercise, as we change the positioning of the feet and so on and so forth, lots of things changes. But at a foundation level, you can still imagine moving in water. You can still imagine facing the flow of the river if you wanted to. Raising your toes and your heel. And stepping in. And on the other side. Raising your toes and your heel. And stepping in. Step through. And then change direction. Bring the feet back. So, have your right foot forwards. Do a few rounds of the standing version of Fisherman Cast and Net, which isn't so very different to that first standing exercise that we did, rolling forwards and back, which is just that your weight is moving from foot to foot rather than from front to back of the foot. Similar kind of idea here. You could imagine again flow of the river if you wish. That's a useful image to you. I sometimes find it quite useful. Or you can just imagine being in water. But just because otherwise we're going to run out of time, this time turn so you draw your hands across the body and then they rise up and down as you go forwards. So you're in the front leg now, you turn, you move the weight, you go into your back foot. Okay, so let's try that here. The other foot forwards, few rounds of fisherman cast a net. Remember, really same characteristics of movement, despite the fact that we're standing and we're maybe doing a different exercise, but same characteristics as we began to be aware of in the seated exercises. Obviously, there's an additional thing about, if you've got trouble with your knees or something like that, all of those kind of things. But in a sense, we try and sort of bypass that by focusing our attention to something a little bit deeper in the body, not to ignore those things, not to just pretend they're not happening, but to go just a little bit further with the movement, then turn in. One part of your body is in motion, your whole body is in motion. So we get this sense of the chi, of body, mind, and energy moving as one cohesive unit without obstruction, ideally without obstruction through the body, with a sense of flow, with a sense of harmony. So now, you can just turn the front foot out if you're going to go forwards, go through here. Place the foot forwards, plant the foot forwards, moving through. And again, imagine doing this in water. And then going back. and bring your feet parallel. So go back to your chairs. Before I sit down, just to remind you, we did this little exercise. I call it swaying in the river. There isn't a particular name, it's as good as any. The flow is pushing me back. Then I'm going forwards. My hands are palm forwards, but really that's just a detail. And what we're doing is using a very simple movement to help us to focus on inner characteristics. We could take that into fisherman cast the net. Arms are facing backwards, but again, it's not details like that. You can have your palms forwards if you want, I guess. From the point of view of what I'm talking about, it doesn't really make a difference. You could do it in the chair. Here, of course, the movement is more between hips, buttocks, and your feet and legs. But the same idea, or again, we could put it into fisherman cast the net. And so we train ourselves to recognize these very subtle changes within the body that are appropriate to all of the movements. And that becomes stored in our memory in one way or another. And it becomes part of our sort of automatic, not quite automatic, but a kind of subconscious intent in the movements that we make. And quite often we'll spill over from that into when we're doing the washing up or something like that. So very simple to practice, but having quite a significant effect. So just coming back to seated position, and then embrace tiger, return to mountain. Same characteristics. Maybe you can feel a change from yang to yin, maybe between the upper and lower part of your arm. And that will change here because you're squeezing in. As the hands come down, imagine if you were doing this in water, it'd be the top of your arms now, where you felt that, what I would describe as a denser feeling. But again, it's just a term. Now it's the inside of the arm, and so on and so forth. Eventually you'll get to a point where you don't need to think about it in that way. You certainly don't need to label it in that way. And let your hands come down to rest. Lovely. And open your eyes. As always, thank you very much, everybody.